Today I'm out in North Carolina taking a look at the all-new 2022 Volkswagen GTI. This is the all-new 8th generation of the Golf, and there's some pretty big changes for this model year. We have an updated version of the 2-liter turbo under the hood, an entirely new interior with the latest Volkswagen tech, and of course, in this generation Golf, at least in the United States, this is actually also the base Golf. The GTI is where the lineup starts. Where does the Golf line end? That, of course, is the sporty brand new Golf R. If you want to know about that, that's going to be in a separate video. Up front, we have some of Volkswagen's latest full LED headlights, definitely a distinctive and different look than the previous generation, but still instantly recognizable as a Golf. Down here, we have a honeycomb grille, and the most unique feature about the GTI, which I have to say I wish was also implemented on the Golf R, are these multi-module LED fog lights. These are really cool. There are 5 modules on each side, and they're calling this sort of a cross pattern. I really like how Volkswagen has integrated these into the honeycomb grate down below. We, of course, still have the subtle red accents running right across the front. The Volkswagen Golf was not the first hot hatch in the world, but this is certainly the most iconic and the one that's had the longest staying power, being in continuous production for quite some time. Now, in the United States, some changes have happened over the years. Probably the biggest of which you'll notice is that the GTI is available only as a 4-door hatchback. But the practicality that we've come to expect from the Golf is still here because we have a big upright cargo area in the back. That definitely makes this different than the Honda Civic Si. The Civic Si is really styled more like a Sportback or a liftback, definitely longer than this and a little bit harder to park in urban environments. If you're the kind of person that wants something that is a blast to drive, but easy to park in San Francisco or New York, that's why you might want to get a GTI. As with previous generations of the GTI, this definitely looks like a performance hatch, but it doesn't look boy racer necessarily. I like the fact that they've gone for a more restrained design language. We have LED tail lamps back here with LED amber turn signals. Those are definitely a nice touch. Dual exhaust tips at the bottom, but it doesn't have all the sort of boy racer parts that we find on the Golf R, although admittedly even the Golf R is pretty sedate as far as things go. We do have a little bit of a spoiler right there at top of the hatch. Under the hood, we find one of Volkswagen's familiar 2-liter turbos, but it has been tweaked for 2022. Power is up to 241 horsepower, torque comes in at 273. It's mated to your choice of a 6-speed manual transmission or a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. The 7-speed DCT is going to be the fastest way to get your GTI 0 to 60, but interestingly enough, fuel efficiency in this model is identical between the two for the EPA test cycle, although in real-world driving, you're probably going to get better fuel economy with the dual-clutch transmission. If you're the kind of person that wants to compare a performance hatchback with a performance sedan, the DCT is definitely a differentiating factor between this and something like the upcoming Honda Civic Si, because that's widely rumored to come only with a manual transmission. I found front seat comfort to be excellent. These seats are more adjustable than the ones that we find in the Jetta, a big reason that you might want to get this over the GLI. Specifically, the seat bottom cushion adjusts for tilt, and we have 4-way adjustable lumbar support, something that we don't see on that Jetta GLI. We still have a tilt telescopic steering column with a very large range of motion, and the front passenger seat is still a manual design, not powered. Hopping into the back, we find more generous accommodations than you'll find in the upcoming Kona N, but you will find a larger cabin in something like the Volkswagen Jetta. Headroom is superior in the Golf. That's the big reason to buy this over that. I have about 1.5 inches of headroom left or so, but I definitely have less legroom than you'll find in the Jetta. Keep in mind, of course, this is going to be easier to park. There are a number of nice touches back here, like pockets in the rear seat backs where you can put smartphones, things like that. Scooting over to the right side, things definitely seem a little bit tight back here, and the rear bench is a little bit narrower than some of the compact sedans. In this trim, there are a number of nice touches in the rear, like rear heated seats, tri-zone automatic climate control. The rear seats fold in a 40-60 fashion, and there's a ski pass-through right here in the center section, so if you did want to put some larger items inside and you still needed to carry 4 passengers, you can do that. Actual capacity may be higher in some of the sedan competition, but practicality is certainly higher in the Golf. This is the kind of vehicle that could very easily swallow a barbecue. If you're at Home Depot and you suddenly decide one's on sale and you want to buy it, you wouldn't have to go home and swap vehicles. There are also a number of other nice cargo touches back here, like a load floor with some little detents here so it'll actually stay up and in place. It's also a 2-stage load floor so you can lower it down and get more cargo room, and there's even a temporary spare tire under there. As we take a quick spin around the interior, you'll definitely notice that the GTI gets all the latest Volkswagen components, whereas the GLI is a generation behind. So lots of touch controls up here for the map lights, the sunroof right there. There's a pretty standard sized sunroof just over the driver and front passengers' heads. We get a new seat design in here. It's pretty similar to the one that we find in the Golf R, but there are some subtle differences. Height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, fixed in place head restraints right there. The Golf R gives us blue accents, the GTI gives us red accents on these optional leather seats. These seats are heated and ventilated, and as you can see, we have some pretty aggressive bolstering on the front seat back and seat bottom cushion, but I had absolutely no problem finding a comfortable driving position in here. There are a decent number of sport seats out there that tend to be a little bit tight in the shoulder area. I didn't find that to be a problem at all. Moving over to the front doors, you'll find soft touch materials in the upper section of the door and the mid section of the door, and then hard plastics some of those areas around. There's also a large storage compartment in the door that is definitely very handy right there. Moving over to the dashboard, we have sort of a hexagon pattern, I guess you could say, or honeycomb pattern going on for the trim on the doors and the dashboard. There's a soft touch injection molded upper section of the dash. This definitely has a bit of an Audi vibe to it, which is absolutely not a problem for me at all. Down below there, we have a large bin-style glove compartment. There'd be no problem fitting a large tablet computer inside. Moving over to the dashboard, we find a touchscreen infotainment system here in the middle of the dashboard. There are different sizes depending on the market that you're taking a look at the Golf in. This is the larger arrangement that is available worldwide. This has the latest software from Volkswagen. It's very similar to what we see in the ID4. There's a home button right over here on this side, but most of the screens occupy the remainder of that screen. This, of course, supports smartphone integration, and the big departure for Volkswagen is the fact that we have a touch button bank right down here, and then we have touch buttons here, but everything else is controlled within the system. So climate there, the assist systems, parking systems, drive mode select, all that is done within the touchscreen after you've pressed the button below. We then have touch sliders for the temperature, volume over here, and a touch button for the system power. Below that we have two USB-C inputs. Those definitely put out a decent amount of power. There's a storage area you could put your larger smartphone, but it's a little bit tricky if it's plugged in. Engine start stop button there. The center console definitely changes depending on whether you get the GTI or the Golf R. This one is the model with the 6-speed manual, but I've actually spent most of my time today with the one that had the 7-speed DCT. There's an electric parking brake button right there. Two large cup holders here. This one has some little retractable arms. You can push those in, use this area as a storage cubby. You can see this also gets Volkswagen's latest key that we also see in the ID4. 12-volt power port right there. Same center armrest that we find in other Volkswagen Golf models. It ratchets into position, so I can lift that up like that. If I want my armrest to be a little higher, it extends in and out, and then opens completely to reveal a fairly small storage compartment. On the driver's side, there's an available full-color heads-up display, which is really a nice touch in here. And all models get a slightly larger full-color LCD instrument cluster. This is Volkswagen's latest design that has some really cool touches like this kilowatt power meter right here inside the tachometer. What's really cool about that is you can see the power gauge moving up and down, and sort of at a different rate than the tachometer moves up and down. Kind of gives us a little bit of extra visual interest. This display, as we see in other Volkswagen models, is highly configurable. Not quite as configurable as the Audi A3, but you can see we have a moving map display right there in the middle, which definitely puts this ahead of pretty much every other mainstream competitor out there. You can also control most of these screens. As I cycle through them, you'll notice that there are sort of three sections of the screen: middle section, outer sides there, and you can configure what's in each of those sections independently. So there's a lot of configurability there. All right, it's now time to get the GTI out on the road, and I should warn you in advance that I haven't had as much time as I would like in the GTI because I'm also driving the new Golf R and, of course, the Jetta GLI on the same day. It's also kind of a wet and drizzly day out here in Asheville, North Carolina, but this is a really good place to test out the limited slip functionality in the GTI. That's one of the best features about this, and something that you don't find necessarily in all of the inexpensive performance vehicles in America. That really is going to make the GTI feel more sure-footed. You'll also find it in the Golf R, of course, that also has all-wheel drive. But of course, the GTI is all about front-wheel drive inexpensive performance. It's that classic hot hatch format. As far as 0 to 60 goes, I don't have an official 0 to 60 time for this GTI just yet. You'll have to wait until I can get my hands on one at home. But logically, the model with the DSG transmission is going to be the fastest 0 to 60, and of course the most predictable in terms of 0 to 60. That's logically the main reason that even though the 6-speed manual transmission is unquestionably more fun than the dual-clutch transmission, the DSG is the more popular option. Now that we're out on the highway, this is a good place to talk about the active safety systems in the GTI. Volkswagen has simplified their lineup a bit for 2022. Some vehicles have lost trim levels, and a lot of vehicles have had consolidated options. So now with the GTI, basically everything becomes standard. There are a few variations depending on whether you get the 6-speed manual or the 7-speed DSG, but importantly, we still get adaptive cruise control with the manual transmission and Volkswagen's aggressive lane centering software. Another nice touch with the adaptive cruise control system is that I can change gears, just put in the clutch, pop it into 5th gear if I want to, and it actually stays in the adaptive cruise control mode. Not every vehicle out there with adaptive cruise control has this particular functionality, but it is becoming more common. Once the road starts winding, you'll definitely notice that this is the most refined version of the GTI that Volkswagen has ever produced. This is, of course, pretty closely related to the all-new Audi A3 and Audi S3, so I suppose you really have a pretty important decision to make if you're interested in something like this, something German, something front-wheel drive, something fun, or all-wheel drive, of course, if you take a look at the Golf R, or of course those Audis. Do you want the one with the luxury nameplate on it? Do you want the one with the Volkswagen badge on the front? Do you want a hatchback, or do you want a sedan? Inside the Volkswagen portfolio of companies, there are a ton of options. You could even get something like that gray Volkswagen GLI that's right in front of me. Now, the GLI for 2022 isn't quite the same as simply a sedan version of the Golf. You will notice a few key differences. It's not going to feel quite as engaging, not quite as sharp. You don't get quite as much power out of the engine either. Once upon a time, there were a decent number of hot hatch and hot sedan offerings around the world, but times have changed and people are really focusing on more performance-oriented crossovers these days, leaving relatively few options that will directly compete with the GTI. But thanks to the practicality that we find in the hatchback format of the GTI, I argue that you really could compare this directly to something like the subcompact performance version of the Kona N. The Kona N is an interesting twist, of course, because it's going to be front-wheel drive rather than all-wheel drive, and if you wanted performance with all-wheel drive in a Golf, you can get one in the Golf R. As far as handling goes, the GTI is impeccable, and again, out on this road, you will definitely notice the limited slip functionality on that front differential. This is a really good balance between affordability, fuel economy, and performance, I would say. If you don't want the added complexity, added cost, etc. from all-wheel drive, then I think you'll be just fine in this, even if you live in an area that gets more inclement weather, say snow, ice, etc. This is going to feel very sure-footed. It's not going to have the added traction benefit, of course, that we find in the Golf R, but I think it's a worthy trade-off. Since I haven't been driving this at home, it is a little bit difficult to talk about fuel economy and cabin quietness, but one thing that I have noticed is that the exhaust in the GTI does sound just a little bit drony to my ear. I prefer something a little bit quieter, and in my opinion, the Jetta GLI appears to be just a little bit more civilized, and of course things are a bit more raucous in the Golf R. As was seen with other Volkswagen vehicles, I expect this to get pretty close to the EPA estimates when it comes to fuel economy. This has a pretty efficient 2-liter turbo in it. Of course, keep in mind that you will get the best fuel economy if you choose the dual-clutch automatic transmission. If you're shopping for a GTI as a daily driver and you're worried that the suspension tune might be a little bit too harsh, then you definitely want to get the top-end Autobahn trim, because that comes with an adaptive suspension system standard. And this is one of the best adaptive suspension systems in an inexpensive car in America. And by that I mean under about $40,000 or so. The amount of variation we get between the suspension modes is pretty reasonable, and that means that you can definitely get a comfortable setting for daily driving. At the moment, bottom lining the GTI is honestly really easy. This is a ton of fun, and the price tag makes the GTI incredibly compelling. If you can convince yourself or convince your spouse or your significant other that you don't really need a compact crossover like a RAV4 or a CR-V, honestly, a GTI could be your all-around best vehicle. We have the cargo practicality that you'd find in something small like a Volkswagen Taos or perhaps a Honda HR-V, and just way more driving fun. Better 0 to 60, better braking, better handling scores, tons better precision, and lots of standard equipment as well. I love the fact that this has a heads-up display, we have the digital LCD instrument cluster standard, and even though the infotainment software is not exactly my cup of tea, it definitely is better than we find in a lot of inexpensive crossovers out there. And then there's just the handling ability. This is so much fun to drive. Volkswagen has simplified the pricing lineup a little bit for 2022, but there are still a few different flavors of GTI. Let's go through them. We have the S trim, which starts at $29,545 for the manual transmission, $30,345 for the dual clutch. The SE trim, which starts at $34,295, and the Autobahn, which is this model right here, started at $37,995. If you want the automatic transmission, it's the same price upgrade on this trim as with the rest of the trims. If you want features like the heads-up display, the adaptive dampers, etc., that's going to be found only on this top-end trim. The SE trim provides a good middle ground with a lot of the features that you find on this model, but not everything. It has the upgraded navigation system, the upgraded sound system, but the leather upholstery is not standard. It is available on the SE, but cloth seats, which are pretty distinctive for the GTI trim, those are what you'll find on that SE model. If I were shopping for a GTI today, I would absolutely have to get the top-end trim because Volkswagen has done such a good job with the adaptive damping system. Early attempts at inexpensive adaptive dampers honestly were pretty terrible. There was too much of a disconnect between the damping rates and the spring rates in the vehicle, and I think Volkswagen has gotten it exactly right on this car. Now, that's not to say that the base suspension in the GTI is unlivable. I think it's just fine for a performance hatchback like this. But upgrading to the adaptive dampers means that this is the kind of vehicle for all situations. You can drive it daily, even out on a rougher country road if you live in that kind of situation. You can drive it in inner city areas with really poorly paved concrete. Or you can put it in sport mode and have a ton of fun out on your perfectly paved winding mountain road. Any way you slice it, that is a feature that I absolutely must have. I also like the heads-up display. You'll find that only in the top-end trim. You also will only find the leather interior in this model in that top-end trim as well. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you cross-shop with the GTI? Because at the moment, there's not a lot out there that is like this. We do have the upcoming Honda Civic Si, but it looks like it's going to be sedan only, not hatchback. Then you'd have to step up to the Honda Civic Type R, which is going to be very limited availability, much more expensive than this, more powerful as well. But oddly enough, not as hatchbacky as the GTI. So if you want this format of practicality, something that is about the same size on the outside as some subcompact crossovers, has just about as much cargo room and practicality on the inside, but is definitely sportier to drive, you've got one vehicle, this one. As always, be sure and stay tuned for my full review on the new GTI just as soon as I can get that out and get it back at home. In the meantime, be sure and hit me up over at facebook.com/AlexNauto so you can see what I'm driving this week, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places, and of course, check out the merch store at awaymerch.com. I'll see all of you next week.